Hello and welcome to the vCD Roundtable May edition. After we have started off the year with a few setups of individual ones, which came out in, I think, 1 week difference. But now we are back together. We are at least 4 people. I'm not sure if there is an earthquake going on in parallel where Jörg is placed, but at least it doesn't come up to northern Germany. And as it's not shaking in Austria as well, it seems to be a very local spot of an earthquake. But other than that, welcome to the vCD Roundtable. We are a group of 4 today. And let's do a quick round of intros. My name is Yves Sanford, CEO of Comdivision, but also one of our cloud architects. I deal with vCD designs and all things vCD every day, and I'm handing over to Jörg.
Yeah, Jörg, I'm a technical product manager in VMware's cloud provider team. And with that, I guess to Romain.
I was on mute because I have children at home. It's Wednesdays. Yeah, Romain Decker. I work for VMware in the same group as Jörg. I'm the guy who does all the patching between the virtual switches. Matthias?
Yeah, Matthias Eisner, partner at Comdivision, cloud architect as well, trying to automate the stuff Yves thinks about.
Yeah. My stuff always works on PowerPoint. I just left a discussion about whether you can have MQTT and RabbitMQ run at the same point in time with a different API version. I said yes, and then said it's like, Matthias will show you how to do that. Based on your look, you don't even know what I'm talking about.
Maybe if I don't move, no one can see me. No.
Good, but hey, as we have Jörg and Matthias on board. Matthias, you joined the dark forces of using HashiCorp and Terraform lately. So what's your experience in combination with vCD? Let's push that out as a topic. And it's completely unprepared, and I know you hate that now.
Yeah, no, that's true. So speaking of, happy Star Wars Day, everyone. May the 4th be with you. You started it, not me. Yeah, so speaking of joining the dark side of the force and playing around with Terraform, HashiCorp, being honest, I haven't tried the vCD provider so far. I'm playing around with the NSX-v Terraform provider, and that one has, let's phrase it, advantages and disadvantages. So the idea behind the whole Terraform story is pretty nice if you work with highly standardized infrastructures. As soon as you start trying to build customized infrastructure for different customers, it might get a pain unless you figure out a way how to dynamically build the whole Terraform code. So building code in an automated way. So I'm currently working on a project building Terraform code using VRO. Yeah, I really try that. So that's pretty cool because Terraform offers a JSON version of the whole syntax as well. So you can choose either using Terraform JSON files or the HCL syntax, which is more built to be human interactive from my point of view. But yeah, that's a good starting point. So start using it if you are familiar with the whole standardization of infrastructures, and try to use modules around the whole Terraform to automate Terraform code itself, because otherwise you just produce thousands of lines of code. And the most important hint from my perspective is really test every individual function with the TF provider you're trying to use or you're planning to use. And more important, test those in combination and really work on what if I would like to change an object, because the creation process works perfectly fine. It gets really interesting as soon as you start trying to modify existing objects and or configurations. So that's my point of view.
Great. Jörg, any points from you? I mean, I know you played a lot with it lately, and I think you spoke about it in one of the last sessions that you were preparing something anyway. So.
Yeah, so I mean, Terraform is a nice way to describe the infrastructure as code. I mean, that's the whole point of it, to have like a descriptive format of what you are trying to automate, and then use quite simple Terraform plan and Terraform apply commands to let the Terraform provider make all these complex, otherwise complex API calls to get the infrastructure to that state that you described. Now, when it comes to comparing the like some kind of change management or drift management, that's where you need to work with different constructs in Terraform, these Terraform resources. And depending on the level and the quality of the provider, not all the objects that can be deployed are also represented as data sources, so that Terraform can read back the current state of the infrastructure again. However, you can usually figure that out quite easily, because Terraform does a very good job, and whoever builds these integrations for the providers, they usually do a pretty good job of documenting the different data sources that you have and the different objects that are available in the provider. And since it is an open source project, at least most of the providers that I'm aware of, so these Terraform providers that connect Terraform to different infrastructure pieces, it's not only limited to vSphere. There are a lot of other components as well, public cloud providers, whatever. So these are typically open source projects as well. So you can find the documentation on the Terraform homepage, but you usually also can find the actual source code of the provider on GitHub. And in most cases, even use GitHub issues to get in touch with the developers directly. So for the vCD provider, for example, I know that is actively developed by a team of VMware engineers, and they are very responsive and very transparent about that procedure. So when you look at the GitHub issues, they are responding to questions and problem reports from customers, but they also publish like roadmaps and change logs for the different versions. And I think they just released a few weeks back, like 1 or 2 weeks back, the latest version of the vCD provider, adding a lot of more NSX capabilities.
The 3.6 versions.
Yeah, in vCD context.
Yeah.
Speaking of NSX-t and Terraform, so what's really funny, because other teams are pretty active as well, speaking of NSX-t in that story. So what is still missing, and I tried this platform as shouting out to the development team, please, pretty please, with sugar on top, add VPN configuration to the NSX-t Terraform provider, please. So it's missing for a few years right now. What I saw is someone from VMware actually filed new Terraform provider code for NSX-t containing the VPN solution. So it seems to get there, but that's still something which takes ages until you get the proper configuration. But in that kind of in that story, you just use Terraform, and all the pieces which are missing, you just implement using the REST API in the old-fashioned way. But this is a technical forum as well, Jörg. So you're playing with Terraform as well. So how do you handle the whole storage or storing and backupping the state file? Because what's a huge pain is if you lose the Terraform state file and need to re-import the whole infrastructure, because every single object needs to be imported, described in the Terraform code. So how do you handle the backup and restore, restore validation mechanisms?
Yeah, so usually you have to, in the Terraform environment, separate between the Terraform files themselves, which describe the environment, and then the Terraform state files, which is Terraform figuring out like the actual state of the infrastructure and matching that against the description files. And these state files, for example, you typically don't add to like a Git repository or so, because they are not part of the like the change control for the Terraform files themselves. And it depends on the structure of your Terraform, well, the infrastructure that you want to describe, if you actually need to back up them, or if you rather read out the existing infrastructure while doing a like a Terraform plan to match to the existing environment. Romain, do you have some ideas about that as well?
Yeah, I've seen several times people just using Git to store the JSON that represents the state. But Terraform has well documented all the various ways to have a remote state. The most common one back in the days was AWS S3, S3 bucket just used for that, but it was quite painful to build and so on. Now, since like 2020, I think they have a native Terraform state hosted in Terraform Cloud. It's free. You can just use it. I know it's meant for podcast, but I can just share my screen. It's, do you see my correct screen? I guess so. It's Terraform Cloud. You can just register for free, and you can store the state file. So you can link it to a Git repo. So you have the option to just store the state, or to also build completely, execute the Terraform plan and apply from the Git repo. So if I check this, that's my blog. So I have a list of states here, and that's the backups. So I have states from 2 years ago that I can go and check, and it's you have diffs between states and so on, and you can really dig into like history of states. That's what I'm using, personally speaking. But if you go in the Terraform documentation, you have, I think it's close to 10 remote states options right now. And just to update quickly on what Jörg mentioned, it's not meant really, Terraform is not meant really for change management or change control. But there is an interesting data source that we added in the vCD Terraform provider. It's vCD resource list. It was actually, I actually requested it. You can loop on existing resources, export the config as a data object in Terraform, and just store it in the state. And that's also useful. It's like an extrapolation of what you could do with Terraform. And finally, if you're interested, a shameless plug, but I recorded an Empower session for Terraform for network automation, where I joined vSphere, NSX-t, NSX-ALB, and vCD Terraform together for 3 use cases, 2 specifically for providers. 1 to completely build the networks, the provider networks. 1 to onboard new tenants, and 1 for tenant consumption. So I recorded that for Empower. So you will see the demos at Empower and so on. And I will publish the code on GitHub in a few weeks.
Just
That's very useful information. Thanks for that. Another thing, what I found out, and now I'm trying to compare a bit and ask towards vCD. If you do Terraform and NSX-t, as far as I'm aware of, it's recommended to increase an advanced parameter, allowing more API calls against the NSX-t manager. Because for each single object and resource, Terraform at least fires 1 API call against the NSX-t manager. So the sum up, it's tens of calls per second. And by default, NSX-t manager can't handle it. But there's an advanced parameter and it's documented. On the other hand, how does vCD handle that amount of API calls? Or is the vCD Terraform provider a bit more relaxed in terms of how many API calls it does per second and per object? Have you any idea about that?
So from a vCD perspective, vCD is actually internally pretty good of handling a huge amount of API calls. And I'm almost sure we even published some tested numbers in the maximum configuration guide for Cloud Director. If not, at least we test internally at pretty high scale and have some very large partners, and even internally in our hands-on labs environment where we do a lot of API calls against vCD at a time. That said, currently there is no like throttling mechanism for API calls in vCD or in what vCD does to NSX indeed. But if you run like a Terraform script or a Terraform file against the vCD API, typically it's done as a single user. So the user that you define within the Terraform file, and that all works within the user context of vCD. So even if you like would theoretically overload vCD with that, it typically does not really affect other users. You just might break your own script if you go too heavy on that. However, as I mentioned, vCD is super scalable when it comes to API calls. And if you run into problems with a single Terraform file, then rather have a look at your vCD design.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I just wanted to challenge that, because usually Terraform, when you create Terraform configurations, it's most of the time never objects created in parallel. Most of the time it's objects that are independent to each other, and you have this concept of dependency in Terraform. So most of the time it creates objects dependently of each other. So it will start by creating a T0 and then the interfaces of the T0, but it's dependent on the T0 completion first. Then after the interfaces, you create, I don't know, the BGP configuration, but it's dependent on the interfaces. So you have more like a workflow in the Terraform configuration rather than having like thousands of API call coming into an NSX-v in a very short period of time. I've never seen any issues, and I use Terraform quite extensively. That said, where it could indeed happen is for vCD, potentially, if we wouldn't have good numbers in terms of like API ingestion, because potentially you could have like 1,000 tenants that are like submitting Terraform applies at the same time, which would, I guess, would have like hundreds or thousands of API code at the same time, but it's quite uncommon.
Yeah,
one question which pops up for me is really quick, just to jump in here, as a lot of the stuff around Terraform is open source. If a service provider runs into any issue, who is actually or can they get any kind of support? Who is responsible for the support? What if it breaks something? I mean, those are the usual open source questions always. Is there a commercial support offering available around it, like what some projects have, or is it good luck? If it fails, it's your problem.
So for the Terraform scripts, it would be HashiCorp to be the first like Terraform support contact. And for any particular provider, of course, they will relate to the provider developer. And since these are open source projects, you pretty much get support via GitHub. Now for the vCD provider, it is a VMware engineering team that is assigned to that and is maintaining that, and they are doing a pretty good job, but it's not part of an official like GSS style contract.
Yeah. Which, I mean, the reality is for a lot of things which you do against API of products and stuff like that is it's not necessarily there. So I just wanted to be sure that I have that on the correct list. And then I jumped into, you were just about to say something, Jörg, in the first place before I jumped.
Yeah, first for the support thing, it might actually help if you use that Terraform provider very extensively. It might help to get an API support contract with VMware, because that covers, well, API and client usage. And if you run into any issues that are part of, well, bugs in the Terraform provider, you can't do anything. But if they these bugs rather relate from bugs in the vCD API, then that helps, of course, to identify that and file SRs to that. But there is some debug option for the Terraform provider as well, where you can see which exact API calls the provider does to the vCD API. And that allows you pretty easily to recreate these calls using CURL or PRO or ParseIO or whatever, generic Postman REST calls to the vCD API to reproduce some issues. So you can quite easily find out if you have some problems, if that's a problem in vCD API itself, or rather a problem in the Terraform provider code. And the other thing I was about to mention, there were some discussions in past, for example, based on that dependency structure of the different objects in a Terraform file that actually makes it, yeah, from some perspective, a bit inefficient if you want to deploy multiple things at the same time. So there were some discussions on that GitHub issues section about VApp deployments for large VApps, where you have dozens of virtual machines that are part of the VApps. And the way that the Terraform provider does that in combination with the vCD API is to really create them one by one, rather than having a full vCD API call to create the VApp in once, which vCD could do, but then you don't get that dependency management in Terraform, and therefore the Terraform provider has to do that by creating the VApp and then adding the virtual machines one by one. And that's some of the drawbacks. However, since the benefits of Terraform are rather to configure the state in the Terraform files rather than having a super efficient like automation or deployment, that usually does not impact any of the usage in most scenarios.
Makes sense, makes sense. One other thing, lately there was a new version of the NSX-v to T migration toolkit. And as we all know, but certainly nearly all service providers by now have migrated, hopefully, from V to T. But for the very rare, very small amount of people who have not done that yet, Romain, do you have some overview about some of the latest fixes, goodies, and scenarios which can now be sorted?
Yeah, of course. So first, now the documentation is published on docs.vmware.com. So that's a good thing. So in the past, it was just a PDF in the same download folder. So I moved everything from there into docs.vmware.com. In terms of new features, really the main one is routed VApp network support. So we now support migrations of routed VApp networks and VApp edge services. It does require vCD 10.3.2.1 or newer. So 10.3.3 or 10.3.2.1, that's the very minimum version, because we rely on some changes in the Move VApp API from vCD. Otherwise, we now support UTF-8 characters. So for everyone that has a non-Latin based language and where tenants are creating descriptions or object names in, I don't know, in Arabic characters, kanji, Cyrillic, and so on, that was not supported in the migration. So now that's supported. Also, like specific special characters in descriptions like tabs and when you hit on the enter key, like the break lines and so on. So things that we never imagined at the beginning, and we had to create specific support for that. Then we have a few updated assessment mode, and then the remainings are more like updates about flexibility. You now have the ability to don't have a destination T0. You can have multiple T0 or VRF at the destination. In the past, it was only one. We changed a few fields in the YAML file. We support edge gateway rate limits migrations. We support disk level storage policy, name disk migration. We enhanced that. We did like a good 10 or 12 items, really specifically designed to provide a better experience and really a better flexibility at migrating. And now we are already currently working in the next version of the migration tool. And I know some people asked, well, actually quite a few people asked, the migration tool, the 132, is not yet supported with vCD 10.3.3 officially. We are working on that right now, so this week and next week. So if we don't find any major issue, it will be certified with the latest and greatest vCD version.
And maybe this is one of the areas which I missed, or just because we have all these crazy people show up. Do we have any plans finally to allow vCD migrations for customers which are not using edges? So where you have NSX-v, they use everything as external networks. because they put in crazy other third-party vendor firewalls and don't put NSX edges somewhere. That is a scenario which you currently can't really migrate, and you can't get rid of the old infrastructure from that perspective, because you can't move things off of it in the same way. Because if you try to move the workloads without the migration toolkit, it more or less tells you that the target side is actually NSX-t and the source side is V, which is like, yeah, that's intended, but there is
that's already supported for a while now. I would say since the 1.2.1 version, so since last Q1 2021, you can migrate directly connected or VDC networks. You can migrate all VDCs that are on an NSX-v provider VDC, but that consume no NSX-v services whatsoever. So we have a lot of flexibility around that. But the only thing that we cannot do, and that's by design, it's obviously, is transform the networking at the same time of the migration. We got several requests of being able to do that. Like, I have so many edges with that configuration in the source, and I want only one edge at the destination with that other configuration in the destination. That's something that we cannot really plan, because you have too many scenarios to handle. And it's a migration tool from V to T. We take some shortcuts into trying to guess what tenants have configured and why they configured it, to transform them, the same features and the same configuration, into NSX-t. But we provide also a lot of flexibility, and everything is described in docs.vmware.com in the documentation. We have like chapters on directly connected or VDC networks, and shared networks, and routed vApp networks, and so on and so on. Sometimes you even have options with YAML, so fields in the YAML file that you can enable, disable, and so on.
Good. I think that's a good point out of it. One last one, because I had that request and maybe I missed it somewhere. And maybe that's also a question towards Jörg. Is there a way, if I currently have a vCenter which has an NSX-v behind it, to just remove the NSX-v and put an NSX-t against it? Because we had some struggle with that at one service provider. I'm not sure if that was version related, but I think it's still on one of my open items list on what we need to.
Let me ask, do you mean to kind of update an existing PVDC in VCD?
Yes.
From just vCenter only to vCenter plus NSX-t?
Yes, because the service provider has basically deployed NSX-v, but never really used it for anything and just has external networks on it. And based on that scenario, there is more or less nothing really to migrate, just to rip out the old one and put the new one in. Not saying that they are going to, I mean, they have use cases for NSX-t, but that is something which I have seen now at least 1 or 2 times. I think we got around it most cases because we were using vCDA or something else then to move the workloads over. But I'm pretty sure with the list of cases we still have ahead of us, there are potentially cases where that might come up again.
I remember we filed that question a year ago, different context, same question. Maybe 1 year later, we might get a different answer.
Which answer did you get last time?
It's not supported and not possible.
Yeah, so from a VCD perspective, I think as soon as you enter the NSX-v credentials as part of the vCenter registration in VCD, VCD considers that vCenter as an NSX-v based vCenter. And I don't think you can get rid of that NSX-v part afterwards.
You can, since 10.3, but what you cannot do is transform an existing PVDC into a no NSX PVDC. You have to go to a new one.
So that sort of could be the same vCenter, but you still need different clusters. Yeah.
I still don't like the answer. At least it's consistent over years.
It's a consistent answer. Yes, it's not solving it anyways. Good. Any other news which we missed since 2, 3, 4 weeks ago?
Yeah. So I think we have not spoken about GPU support in this roundtable, haven't we?
We have quickly spoken about, I think, the fact that it might be coming, but not that it happened. And
okay.
based on the fact that NVIDIA still insists that I currently can't get any delivered,
okay.
I'm going to visit a few people in June in California and have a very, very friendly one-on-one discussion about the future.
Okay. Yeah, so that is there now since actually 10.3.2 in vCD, so back since January. And it allows you to, as a provider, you can create vGPU profiles that you publish to ORG-VDCs pretty much in the same way as placement profiles, and they work in the same way as placement profiles. So they make sure that templates, VM templates that you deploy from the catalog, or new VMs where you mark vGPU support, that they land on physical hosts that have the GPU cards in there, and they will configure the GPU profile into the virtual machine so that the virtual machine sees the virtual GPU format. Now, that said, this functionality is there through UI and APIs. We do have some APIs to measure consumption. However, no integration with VROps or tenant app yet for a fully blown chargeback and metering. The reason for that is that vSphere does not provide yet the exact numbers of utilization. And there are some limitations about quota management. And currently, well, you have to follow up, of course, first of all, the guidance from NVIDIA and the vCenter team. They have some pretty extensive documentation for that to bring the physical cards into vCenter with all the necessary VIPs that you have to install and the profiles to like split up these resources. And then there are some recommendations from NVIDIA, even in theory, from vCD perspective, you could have like multi-tenancy and share the same physical card between virtual machines from different tenants. To not do that, because from a it's not a like the same level of full stack multi-tenancy for physical graphic cards as you have for x86 architecture otherwise when it comes to memory separations and stuff like that. So NVIDIA still recommends to keep one card only to be used by one tenant, but of course you can have multiple virtual machines now using the same graphic card.
So speaking about GPUs, does that also mean I can use that in combination with vCD, TKG, and CSE then?
That is what we are currently testing and validating, to have these profiles available for the worker node so that you can run container workloads that need the GPU profiles.
Because that would be the first use case which I potentially would see the most at the moment, because we had requests where service providers currently come up with the whole Tanzu story and then in parallel the GPU story. I mean, we had Horizon and desktop as a service stories, I think 1 or 2 years ago, where they wanted to have GPUs. I think they figured out a different pathway on how to solve that. But now it's more a Tanzu story. So even though the original use case for the story is potentially a different one now, but we think there is still good use for it.
Yeah, so that validation is currently work in progress, and we expect that to work since it's the same mechanism.
Good. Anything else which we missed?
No, my next question would have been the one with the tenant app.
Yeah, so that's where one of the examples where VROps and tenant app needs to get the metrics first from vCenter, and then we can match that to the VMs and do some proper chargeback. But that's will take some time.
Wonderful. Then I think it's a wrap. We have a bit of an idea on what we are going to do in the next session. That might be all around Tanzu, vCD, and a bunch of other things. But we need to line up things first, and then you will see if we get something to go. We might also invite Sasha from our team, who does all the Tanzu pieces on our side as well, into it. So that will be more container and Kubernetes session the next time. Any other closing words before we close the session? I'm handing over to Matthias to start because you were the last to introduce yourself.
Yeah. So Terraform, cool stuff, but my opinion is before you start using it in production, please test all the different Terraform stuff and implementations, and especially together. Thanks. Romain.
I would emphasize on Terraform. Obviously, the production comment is quite obvious for me. It's like the elephant in the room. It's like the same for don't go for production without testing in general. But I would say that I know Terraform since 2019 now, and when I start building something, I start with Terraform if I can. I don't go in the UI. If the provider is here and if I have the correct resources, sometimes it's frustrating because you don't have all the resources. You mentioned VPN for NSX-v, but it's my go-to. I mean, as infrastructure as code, you won't find a tool that can do a lot more than this one.
Yeah, and as a final note from myself, when it comes to Terraform, not only think about your provider use cases, but also advertise it to your tenant users, because Terraform is a very good way to, well, deploy new stuff into the org VDC and consume cloud resources. That's what it's built for. So the vCD provider not only allows you as a provider to automate like tenant onboarding and provider related tasks, but the whole, pretty much the whole API from a tenant perspective is covered as well. So you can use Terraform to deploy vApps, to configure vApp networks, to configure firewalling and so on. And it really is a good way for users, especially, for example, to deploy stuff as part of their continuous integration pipelines when they do software development, and to use Terraform for that. So as a service provider, absolutely engage your customers to have a look at the Terraform provider, use it in tenant context with their tenant credentials against their tenant org VDCs, and they can very easily automate the consumption of your resources.
Wonderful. And I'm going to close with more or less the words that you should never actually do anything in production before you have tested it in the first place. Has something to do with a keynote I just did about an hour ago about disaster recovery in the cloud and everything else. So it's always better to test it first and then go into production, no matter whether it's called Terraform, vCD, NSX, or anything else in the industry. With that, I would say thank you all for watching and listening, and see you all again in a month.